Welcome to the Mosaic Memphis podcast. Our purpose is to support, challenge, and equip you to live out the gospel of Jesus faithfully in your everyday life. We hope this conversation helps you grow in your understanding of Christ and encourages you in your mission to serve Him. Listen in.
Welcome to Mosaic's first ever podcast episode. Our goal here is to really equip, edify, and encourage you as we go through the book of Acts as a church. Some of you who probably thousands are going to be listening to this podcast, right? But if you're just tuning in, Mosaic is a church. Mosaic Church is a church in Memphis, Tennessee, right in the heart of the city, very urban area. And we've been around for about 7 years, and so yeah, we hope that you're going to be blessed by this. Our hope is to really zoom in on some really key trending topics today in our culture and from a Christian perspective. And we want to edify you. We want to encourage you to how you can live faithfully in Jesus' mission in this day, 2021. And so today, for our first guest, I have Justin Burkhead, Michael Phillips with us. Justin Burkhead served at Mosaic as our directional pastor for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And he recently resigned to go full on Chick-fil-A, and realizing that 2 full-time jobs is probably not the best idea. But really blessed to have you guys, have you as a part of it. Married, 4 kids, very active house. And then Michael Phillips, executive director at Sukasa Ministry, married, 2 beautiful kids. He gets the distinct privilege of being a Mosaic's most well-known member, and maybe future mayor.
What?
Right?
How is that? How are we measuring that?
The measurements are clear.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
And
Justin, I hope you noticed he said my kids were beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. Hope my kids don't see this.
Justin's kids are very beautiful as well. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this and sit with us and discuss these things. I pick you guys particularly because I really love the way you think. You're different, but also you love Jesus and want to live faithfully. And so I really appreciate that. So I'm sure that what you guys say is going to blow our minds and enable us to live faithfully in this day. If you've been with us on Sunday mornings, we've been going through the book of Acts, and we call this series through the book of Acts Revision. And what we're really diving into in the book of Acts is what does it mean to live faithfully to Jesus as a church in this day, and to really reimagine what that looks like through the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is just replete of just teachings and doctrines and narrative that helps us be able to see this is what we're called to do and be as Christians, Christ followers in this day. And so about 2 weeks ago, we looked at Acts chapter 2, where the Holy Spirit comes down in this beautiful, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual way that really articulates a lot of God's big vision for his work in this world, his big vision over the world. And that is that the gospel is to reconcile all things to himself and to reconcile us together. And I think it was really significant that that the Holy Spirit comes down in that way, in that moment. Tim Keller talks about how that Jesus, when he started the church, could have started it in one language, but he started a multilingual worship to articulate that this gospel message was for the world, not for one people group. Now, what comes out of that, and what I want to zoom in on and just get into the weeds, if you will, is that there's some implications to what we saw in chapter 2, where you saw all these different people groups that carried along with it a lot of baggage. There was racism, there was bigotry, there was probably a lot of hatred between people groups within those different ethnic demographics. And so what drew out for me is what what does it look like for us? We're a very divided people. We're very, there's a lot of animosity. There's a lot of racial baggage that we're living in. But when you look at Acts, you see them navigate that in a very unique way, almost like a third way. And so I want to dig into the weeds in that a little bit. Talk about this. How does the mission relate to politics and political division? How does it relate to racial, not just racial differences, but racial baggage, which you saw in the book of Acts. You had even Romans in the group, and there was a lot of animosity there. And so that's where I want to zoom in on. And the podcast, really, one of the goals is to, for us at Mosaic, we can't dive into these things on a Sunday morning. But in this podcast, we hope that whether you're out taking a walk or you're jogging, you're driving in your car, you'll be able to just listen to some dialogue on some really specific topics that relate to today. And so let's just get into it. And the first question I just kind of want to dig into, we've been in a very tense political season in this country. I mean, some say the worst since the Civil War. And we all witnessed like what happened at the Capitol, et cetera, and there's a lot of that tension. Well, we know that Christians are in the middle of it. And what we need to know as Christ followers is, how do we navigate political issues and differences and disagreements as it relates to our mandate to spread the gospel throughout the world? And those are tensions, right? Those are tensions that we're always battling. So in the book of Acts, you see that. You see a church that is really focused on the mission, but at the same time, they're engaging with a lot of that division in their day. And so I want to zoom in on the political divisions, maybe even racial divisions in our day. How would you say the mission speaks into that? How does our mission's mandate inform how we deal with political divisions and even racial divisions? So we'll start with you, Justin.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind. As Christians, I think we're called to balance. And what I mean by that is, we don't view any political season in a way that we would freak out, because we are grounded in our faith. We're grounded in what the gospel means for history. The flip side of that is we can use that as a crutch and not get involved at all, right? That's right. And so the right balance, in my mind, is sort of this suave way of engaging, but also not freaking out at the same time. And so, yes, I want to fight against racism. I want to fight for racial justice. I want to fight for what I believe is right, but I also don't need to act like this is the first time a culture has experienced racism. I love what you said, the word baggage. I've not thought about that before. So I'm white. I live in Memphis. When I hear racism, my sin leads me to cringe a little bit. Like, well, I'm not racist, right? But the fault in that is that I'm ignoring the baggage. I'm ignoring the history. And as Christians, even though we anchor history in the gospel and in biblical history, which is really, really, centuries long, it doesn't mean that we get to be insensitive about today. And in fact, everything that we believe over the last few centuries, if we know it well and really are convicted by it, ought to impact what we believe today. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I would start there at least.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I would say foundationally, starting from it, I think there's a few sort of reference points when we think about it. And I think for me, the first thing that I think about is that when you read in the book of Acts specifically, right, you're in a moment and in a culture, right, where people are asking to be released from oppression, right? They're coming to the faith in that environment where there are marginalized and oppressed people who don't have a voice, who don't have anything. Right. No one's listening to them. No one cares about what they have to say about any of that. And those people are coming to the faith in that environment. But the focus of the church within that context, right, is to focus their effort on sort of the local body of the church, right? And as they're operating in a way that they look to their immediate neighbors, right? And they're saying, how is it that the church can be that beloved community, that space where all of us have to sacrifice, right? they had all things in common, right? It says in Acts. And so I think there's an idea of everyone has to let things go to come into that space. But I think what we see uniquely within the context of Acts is that because you had marginalized and oppressed people coming into that space, right? We sometimes, I think, can come from a position of privilege, and we feel like that people have to come into a space that we're comfortable with, and they have to lose their baggage.
Sure.
Right? And so I think that it's really important as we talk about these things to think about that power dynamic was not irrelevant or unseen, right? It was there and it existed. And you see the church as a place where those things, and we hear Paul talk about these dynamics over and over again in his letters in the New Testament, right? That the church, that the communion table, that the way that the church operates ought to not look like the trading tables you see in the market. It ought to not look like the political environment that you see in government, right? And I think that we can even really be informed on the other side of all of that, that when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, they were laying down those palm trees because they thought he was coming to lead a political revolution, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And he specifically said, that's not what I'm here for, right? And he alluded to that. There's echoes of that previously in the Gospels, right? Whenever they ask him, well, should we pay taxes? Right? And he said, I mean, you're asking me about two different systems. I'm not here to deal with Caesar's money. Let Caesar deal with what is Caesar's. I'm here to bring a new system. It has a new way, right? So it's that third way that you're talking about. And so I think that there has to be a reality in which we reject the systems of here and now wholly, even if we can see how much they benefit us and therefore are sort of predetermined, predisposed, I suppose, to sort of have a sense of like trying to protect those things because they feel good to us unconsciously because they're good for us, right? And we have to be willing to throw those out, even if it feels painful to us.
And you're talking about those systems. You're thinking political parties, even not just the general culture itself, but like.
I mean, I think I would even more foundational to that. I would say that there is an operating system of this world that the gospel fundamentally departs from. And that operating system of the world is that I gain power and I strengthen my power, right, for what I see as good, right? The gospel message, however, is Jesus spends every day of his life giving his power away, whether it's through seeing people be healed, right? What does he say when the woman touches his cloth? Where did this power go out of me? Right? He was very aware of the fact that his power was going out, right? And that can sound like magical and all that sort of stuff, and it certainly was in a way. But I also think like there's just like all of us are living in levels and positions of power, and the gospel message and the gospel system is give everything you have away, give it away, give it away, and we grow together by giving it away instead of pooling it for our own purposes, no matter our good intents
and no matter our political persuasion.
Sure.
Yeah, I like what you said there. And when you look at the book of Acts, which it opens up with that same tension where the disciples are like, okay, Jesus, are you about to come to usher in the kingdom? And he said that time and the place is not for you to decide. Here's what you're to do. And so to get even more specific, then because some people will argue and say, well, we're not a political organization, but as Christians, we're called to have influence in places of power. So maybe it'd be helpful to talk about like even specifically, and we may not even have anything we can say specifically, maybe you can say in your own perspective, what does engaging with politics in that third way look like?
So I think the frustrating answer to that question is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach for every Christian. I think that some of us are given gifts, eloquence, that's one example where God has given us that gift in order to rise up in civic culture and speak into things in certain ways. Others of us are given the gift of persistence, and being a good neighbor and just being present. And those things aren't in competition, but I do think what we need, just like I believe the church needs small local churches and big mega churches, I think God's calling us all to different approaches, as long as the key is, does this glorify the Lord? Am I honoring Jesus, or has this become about me? Am I glorifying what the Lord wants glorified, showing the world the way he loves, the way he sees? Am I representing sacrifice? You mentioned sacrifice earlier, and in Acts 2, they sold and gave, two big verbs that came out of freedom. Those people honestly believed that God had given them all things. That's what Paul would talk about later in epistles. And out of that faith, they started giving the tangibles away. Jesus gave his life, and not that I'm in the mind of Jesus or anything, but like he knew he was going to be lifted up. He knew the prophecies, and so we operate out of a freedom that's based on God's promises, and that's what the most difficult part of this is, I think. But if we can figure that out, if we can do that consistently, that's when Acts 2 becomes a reality.
And what you said, there's so much wisdom, because a lot of times as Christians we don't allow people that kind of freedom to articulate God's gifting in them. In a way that's unique. We think everybody needs to be just like us, and I like that understanding is like the body of Christ is very diverse in that, And but I do want to. This leads us kind of to the next question. Where is today? Maybe we can give examples, but also just talk about inappropriate responses to politics from Christians. Like, where is it inappropriate? And I do want to. I know it's hard to say. Well, I'm going to say what's inappropriate. But even thinking in terms of God, our missions mandate, what we know of the book of Acts, where is that line crossed that probably Christians shouldn't? What would you say?
Well, so I think piggybacking a little bit off of what Justin just said, and like moving into the question that you asked, I think that there's a couple of different ways that you could approach it, right? There is a mission-minded gospel sort of mindset about what it is that we're doing, but there's also like a tactical perspective about how politics and the systems of this world operate, and therefore sort of like different people have different roles to play within the context of, you have civil society and third space between the market and the state, right? And so there's and churches exist in the same space as advocates and activists, right? That's all the space between the market and the state. And so the role of all of those organizations and entities in that space, right, is to toe the tension of things that the market is not going to be incentivized to do, and the state is not going to be able to do, right? And so that's where all of this stuff sort of falls through, right? And so we operate in sort of a governing establishment, which is establishing those lines, right? What is the state's job? What can the state do? What won't or can't the state do? Same thing for the market. Therefore, what's left to churches, nonprofits, community organizations, NGOs, whatever it may be in that space. And so from a tactical perspective, right, on the political side of things, it's the job of all of us to create tension for those people who are making decisions. Does that mean that we put all of our hope for the livelihood and for the good things that are going to happen in life for anyone in a political and or state solution or a market solution?
Right.
No, I don't think so. I think that we have to put our ultimate hope and aspirations in the gospel and in the spiritual workings that are happening within all of that context. But at the same time, just like I was saying earlier, how we see in the early church, it's a local church. It's in a specific geographic location, even specific like neighborhood location, right? And so I think it's natural within that context to be connected to and to feel the burdens and needs of your direct neighbors. And therefore, if and when you do have access to some level of persuasion with people in positions of power on behalf of those folks, I think we have to stand up and speak on their behalf. So I say all of that to set the foundation that I don't think speaking out actively and being loud and challenging people and standing up to people in positions of power, I definitely don't think that that's an inappropriate response. I think it's a very appropriate response. I think especially from believers, whenever we're in the middle, especially in the current political environment, who we are as believers is under scrutiny because people in positions of power,
Yeah.
right, have now made it, right, they have built coalitions of their own power around manipulating our faith to make us believe we need to be on one side or the other of that political divide, right? And so, like, we have to understand that that's part of the tension. And so, by us
Yeah.
being in that position, we have power, right?
Right,
And I can,
right.
from like a really specific, I know that in the state of Tennessee, 2 years ago, Bill Lee was considering not allowing refugees to come into the state of Tennessee. The Trump administration had set up this deal where they were basically not letting any refugees in. And so they said the states have to say yes. It's not an opt-out, it's an opt-in. The states have to say yes. And so every state governor was under pressure about it. And I called Bill Lee's office twice a day for 2 weeks or something like that. And I was not the only one. And it's because I wanted him to hear me say there are neighbors in my community that will suffer, who are waiting for their brothers and sisters and mothers to come see them. And those people have been in a long UN vetted process, right? There's literally never been a crime committed by a refugee that's on a national security level, right? Like that has never happened. And yet those are the arguments being used to keep refugees out because they were dangerous and so forth and so on.
And what I love about that picture is it was very, like you said, on the ground, specific in your context,
Absolutely.
but it was also, it's not politically motivated. It is,
Correct.
you're fighting for a specific group of people for a
Right.
specific issue outside of a but people will always assume,
Right.
that's a political position, where as Christians we have to navigate that tension. But yeah.
But to my earlier point, it wasn't me gaining power.
Right.
It was me understanding that I have power and doing my best to give that away on
Yeah.
behalf of those that I know are suffering under the current system.
Now, you've heard Christian leaders talk about a war with the other side. They use war language, battle language, which the Bible does. You use war language and battle language. But specifically when it comes to issues like maybe political sides or certain positions in our country, we speak about, let's defeat this group and let's defeat these people. Now, my pushback or even question about that is there a way in which Christians can go too far in the fact that are these individuals people to defeat, or as Christians, are we trying to defeat their agenda, or is our primary, and this gets really tense, but is our primary responsibility is to win them to a gospel message? Does that make sense? So,
I mean, it can be dangerous. Like one of the commands of scriptures is to love your enemies. And even that language pits me
Yes.
against somebody.
Yeah.
But it does that very dramatically to prove the sacrificial love that I'm to have. And so I think for members of Mosaic, for anybody that is, supposed to be defined by Jesus, their identities in Jesus, I think we would be a lot, in general, more careful with every single word we chose. But again, to Michael's point, that might also lead even more of us to be more vocal, and the ones that are more vocal to be less.
Right,
Each is
right.
given, a different amount of grace, a different amount of faith, different seasons of life, even. Yeah, and I think one of the beautiful parts about a local church is that maybe I have a brother in Christ to go and practice some of those things first with. Maybe I have a really heartfelt message on Facebook, but maybe I'm going to ask Michael to read over it first, and the Spirit could work within us to, I still get to do what I was originally wanting. And I think we bypass community a lot in that. So,
yeah.
yeah.
One of the tensions I feel often when I look at the book of Acts is harking back to that cultural baggage that everybody had in that day and there's a lot. They were living on a very oppressive regime, yet you don't find them deviating much from the mission that Jesus has called them to, and it feels so different. Almost, it is the third way that we, I think, aren't able to live out, or let me say, we have failed to over the last I don't know, 100 years it feels like to live out. But the tension I feel often is that, I am to love those maybe racist people who would love to take away power from people that look like me. At some point, they're not my enemy. They are my mission. And so I have these internal battles personally to navigate that balance, to see, the people that are really probably against me are also the people that God has called me to love and invest in. And you don't see that in the Christian community broadly. You see it in pockets. But broadly, we don't see Christians who know how to live that out. You may disagree with the homosexual community, but you still love them and see them as your mission field. And you have Christians on one side who lob bombs on them, and they want to destroy the gay agenda, et cetera, et cetera. On the opposite side, you have those who, when it comes to issues of social justice and inequality racially, who want to destroy the racist side, and those people who want to maintain power and control and don't get it. They're not woke, so to speak. And so what I've seen over these last few years, particularly, is this, just this, what I believe is just an unbalanced approach to how to live the mission out in such a setting, in a way which we still call out the sin, but to use a cliche, we love the sinner. Yeah. And so, it's a tension, isn't it? It's a tension that we live in. And certainly we would probably all agree that lobbing, social media bombs, Twitter tweets or whatever, is not helpful. But continue in that frame of thought, like what are some things or maybe some things that you've done to navigate that tension in such a way where you see these people, you don't agree with them, you don't agree with their lifestyle, you don't agree with their agenda, but you still see them as your mission.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I hope what I've done, and I doubt I've done it well, is to not allow homosexuality or skin color or political view to define my relationship with any one person. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, we're human beings. We breathe oxygen. We were created to need love. Like, there's so many other avenues to build a relationship through, whether it's the Grizzlies or I grew up in Orange Mound 2 or Hickory Hill 2, and then eventually earn relational credibility to where you get the freedom to say something about the points of disagreement. But I think the culture we live in is find the point of disagreement first and start a relationship bent on that, and that's never going to work.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
I mean, I'll say this: I haven't found social media to be a particularly constructive place to have conversations.
Right.
Yeah,
and so
the medium itself doesn't lend to that.
So I've stopped doing that, to be honest. And so to me, I think to me that comes from obviously everyone knows this by now. I'm a huge talker. I talk without thinking, and I talk to think. And so I have found in my life that I'm always better when I stop and think and listen, rather than trying to get my point across. I'm deeply internally motivated to get my point across. And so I have found as a result of that, right? I remember clearly, I think I was 19 maybe, I read in James where it was talking about the tongue is a fire that'll consume you, right? Man, I was really strong language, for someone who uses as many words as me. I got really fearful, right? I was like, what? What does this mean, And so I think that, to me, I think that may be the first thing, And I remember I watched this Philip Seymour Hoffman movie called Doubt, and he's a priest in that movie, and he's dealing with this issue where people are saying things behind his back, and you never really know what the answer is. Of course, it's called Doubt. But And he tells the story about, and I'll do this really quickly, about a woman who goes to confessions. She says, Father, I've sinned, I've gossiped. What should I do? What's my penance? And he says, I need you to go into your room, find your pillow, take it to the top of the church, split it open, and fan it out, and then come back. And so she does it. She comes back, she's like, Father, I've done everything you said of me. Am I forgiven? And he's like, no. Now I need you to go pick up every feather that you released.
Yeah.
And she says, there's no way I could possibly ever do that. They're gone. They're just, who knows where they are. And he's like, that's gossip. And so, and at the end of the day, to me, that was illustrative because it, when the words come out of your mouth, they're out. The damage is done. You're never, no matter how many times you apologize, no matter how many kind things you do to make that trust back up, you have eliminated some level of trust when you've made that poor choice with your words. And I don't say that to condemn anyone or say that you can't ever make it up, but the reality is when the hurt happens, I mean, we all know those moments when that cutting word was said to us that cut straight to our bones, right? Split us in half, and we'll never forget it because it reinforces those negative narratives in the back of our heads that tells us that we're not worth anything, that we'll never, whatever your negative narratives are, whatever they'll be, and so I think that when we talk about all of this and we think about kindness and we think about love and we talk about the gospel being an open door, right? And we talk about the gospel being, and talk about the beloved community, right? Part of allowing people to see that and part of pointing people to that, I think, is biting our tongue, and not being so quick to jump in and say, this is this and that is that, but to hear them and hear their experience and hear how they've come to their thinking. And for me, I find myself much more these days being focused on what are the sort of fundamental foundational things. Right. And I'm much more concerned with, is this person earnestly seeking God and seeking the gospel? Do I see that in them? Right. And maybe I don't see it and I'm wrong, like it doesn't even, that doesn't even mean anything, or not necessarily mean anything, so given all of that, I think that's where I land, especially in the one-on-one space. When we're talking about systems, I think that we can speak about a system and about how people are influenced by a system and what's happening in a system with much more direct language, because we're speaking about it as a system. And I think part of the problem of the complexity of these things is when people's identity has gotten attached to what they have, the meaning they have attached to that system, and what it means, right? And that can manifest itself in nationalism as opposed to patriotism. It can manifest itself in jingoism as opposed to like an honest sense about like, do we have good protocols for how our country is run, right? There are lots of ways that can manifest itself in which my identity is attached to this idea of what the system is. And because of that, any assault on that system is an assault on me. And the truth is, myself included here, very often I feel that way because I'm attached to that system because it does give me power. And I can see that power slipping away, and I don't think about it that way in my mind, right? It's not natural for us to think about it that way. Some people do, but I don't necessarily always do that. We don't necessarily think about it that way, but that's what that ouch in our heart is. Is us feeling the potential loss of something.
That's good.
And I think that we just have to be very careful and just think differently about how all those things interact.
It's something you said when you talked about systems versus the individual. And, when I heard you say that, it just brought to my mind even more clarity in terms of how we live in that tension. Is that there's one relationship to a system versus to a people, to a person, So for me, I always go back, right now, like in my life, as an African American married to a Polish girl, this is great for me because, before it would have been illegal. In fact, I would be illegal. My presence would have been illegal. That system was just flawed. The tension for me also, though, is those same people who saw me as, a violation are also the people I'm called to. And so somehow separating, which is really hard because we're tied to the system, and systems aren't, like this entity on the outside that people aren't related to. Like the systems were created by people. So broken people create broken systems. So it's hard to detach the two. But we as Christians have to find a way to do that. So that those people storming the Capitol, for me, with a rebel flag, I don't hate them. I disagree with them, probably, most likely, but I don't hate them.
Yeah.
And I would love to see us as Christ followers, especially at Mosaic, really engaging with that third way in some really significant ways, where we do speak about the systems, but we talk differently about the people.
We hope this episode was a blessing to you. If you've enjoyed listening to our podcast, please let us know and share it with your friends. If you would like to know more about Mosaic Church, you can connect with us online through our website, mosaicmemphis.com.